thank you all for coming back for day 2, for lunch 2 of this conference. And thanks again to AEI for hosting us. And really, I didn't mention this yesterday, this whole idea was Pete Peterson's. And so without Pepperdine, the concept of this wouldn't even exist. And obviously, Pete and his staff have done a lot of the legwork in pulling this off, along with Joel and AEI. This is meant to be another lunch conversation, so similar to what Robbie and I did yesterday. And the thought here was to assemble 3 people who I have heard Robbie speak very affectionately about. And I hope you guys would... Carter rolled his eyes, made a face affectionately in some, inappropriate way. It was that.
I was enjoying the affection.
It's a positive form of affection. Hadley, Robbie looks to you as a father figure, as a mentor, as someone that he has sought to emulate in his own scholarly career. And then Carter and Andrew, even though, like me, neither of you were ever technically Robbie students, Robbie wants to claim you as his students, and he wants to take credit for your subsequent success in life. And he takes great pride in seeing what you both are now doing. And I think he would say to Hadley that the work Robbie has done has been to carry on your work, that you were the OG, so to speak, and he's been extending your project. And then Carter and Andrew have been extending it in different domains. So that said, let me actually introduce them. To my far right, as he will acknowledge, Hadley Arkus.
You bet.
Hadley spent over 50 years teaching political philosophy, political theory, civil liberties, political obligations at Amherst College. And then he, while still at Amherst, he founded the James Wilson Institute, and he currently serves as the founding director of the James Wilson Institute. The author of Too Many Books to Count. I think I own all of them, most from Princeton University Press or from Cambridge University Press. And the most recent one is from Regnery Books. And we have Tom Spence here somewhere, the editor-in-chief of Regnery. Maybe Tom has skipped out for a minute. But titled Mere Natural Law, a play on C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and really a beautiful book. Next, so to Hadley's left, is Carter Sneed. Carter, graduate of St. John's College, professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, a fellow at EPPC, where he's been a fellow, for almost 20 years now, more or less since he left the President's Council on Bioethics, where he first really interacted with Robbie on a intimate level. Carter was a fellow at EPPC. He's been a fellow ever since, and he's also now tenured full professor of law at Notre Dame, and he's the director of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture there. And then to my immediate right is Andrew Walker. Andrew's a professor of theology and ethics at the Southern Baptist Seminary. He's also a fellow at EPPC in our Evangelicals and Civic Life program. Andrew's the author of several books, including, actually, he's the editor of a book titled Social Conservatism for the Common Good. And it's a collection of essays, 20-some essays by Protestants engaging with Robbie George's natural law theory and his political theory, more broadly speaking. Really a beautiful collection of books. He has a book coming out next calendar year. I forget now if it's still the title of Faithful Reason. So the original title was going to be His Glory, Our Good. Yeah. The title that the publisher is going with is Faithful Reason, and it's a evangelical theory of natural law, and it's a natural law theory for Bible-believing Protestants. So I think that's going to be an important book for people to put on their I was going to say wish list, but that's an Amazon product, and I don't even want to suggest that you buy the book at Amazon. All right, I'm going to start with Hadley. You mentioned that Robbie has been kind of continuing your project. It draws to mind the question that we see so much disagreement about, which is what is law for? And I kind of wanted to open up because it seems like both you and Robbie have been trying to remind people that the law is for something more noble than what the lawyers might suggest.
Well,
no offense to the lawyer on the panel.
As President Nixon used to say, I'm glad you asked that question. Actually, this brought home to me that this book came out at the time he was up for tenure. Remember, he was up for tenure. And I remember going over, what should we have in the letters? You better omit that portion about writing speeches for Rehnquist. If he written speeches for Stalin or Brezhnev, that might have been an editor. Okay, yeah, it goes back to the beginning. Really, Robbie's book was kind of baked into the first opening pages of Aristotle's Politics. I found over the years, in talking with lawyers, and ask, what is the purpose of the law? What's the rationale for the law? And the answers usually proceed along two lines. First, for the sake of security, protecting our lives and our property. And second, for the sake of softening the rigors of life by facilitating commerce and exchange. And it comes as news as lawyers that Aristotle anticipated both those lines of argument 1,600 years earlier and refuted them. If that's why you want the law, then guess what? You don't need the law for either one of them. If the law is the polis marked by the presence of law, is the polis merely an alliance for mutual defense or facilitating trade? Well, guess what? The Etruscans and the Carthaginians have done this through the device called a treaty to mutual defense and facilitating trade. The United States and the Soviet Union had treaties for reducing arms and facilitating trade. That didn't mean we stood on the same polity, that citizens of the United States stood in relation to one another as subjects of the Soviet Union. The domestic equivalent of a treaty was a contract. Parties agree. And the relation is confined to the transaction at stake here, the exchange of the goods. Aristotle says, what's missing about this? Well, neither party concerns itself with the character of the other. I could go buy the car. My relations with the dealer are confined to the question of whether I get the product for the price I'm paying, the right product. He may be somebody who discriminates against his other customers on the basis of race. He may be an abusive father and husband. But nothing in my standing as a contracting party gives me the standing to raise those moral questions about it. I could raise those moral questions, say, as a citizen making laws, just as the argument was made that nothing in our standing with the Soviet Union as a treaty partner gave us the standing to make moral demands for the changes in the Soviet regime, to let your Jewish citizens, Jewish subjects emigrate. Aristotle had a fascinating passage where he had, imagine a community of 10,000, a dense community, intermarriage, meals on wheels, everybody helps one another. It could be a vibrant cafe life, but if the relations are confined to contracting, something is missing. What exactly is missing? I used to put it to some of our students in the law schools in this way. I draw upon something I drew upon in that my own book in this vein, The Philosopher of the City, with Princeton years ago. I was recalling Judith Denzengerber at the time in 1977 with the only X-rated program going on in Capitol Hill, where she gave, speaking on the abuse of children, she had examples of gonorrhea of the throat in an 18-month-old girl and in a 9th-month infant. And I said, let's say we're confronted with things of this kind. See somebody doing that. Now, what do you think the natural reaction of the community would be? Let's make a contract with him. Let's offer him a tax incentive to induce him to stop. Or a Netflix subscription. Now, that used to elicit a laugh. Not anymore. People say, lawyers have a hard time thinking, what is the natural reaction? I think the natural reaction is stop. It's the voice of a command. You stop. Who stops? Jones, who's doing it? No. Anyone who's doing the same thing. If it is wrong, the moral logic kicks in. We move beyond statements of really personal taste to speak about the things that are more generally universal. It's not simply wrong for Jones. It's universally wrong. And then, of course, at the beginning, then, you have the crystallized, the classic connection between the logic of morals and the logic of law. We come to the judgment that this is a wrong, that it's wrong for anyone to do. We may lay the groundwork for saying that we would forbid it generally, which is to say we forbid it with the force of law. Well then, so what we have here is the classic understanding that the polis, the polity, is not really a dense community with a heterogeneous population. It's not really an alliance for mutual defense. It's a moral association, meaning it's an association of people who are drawn together because they share some understanding about the terms of principle, and understandings of right and wrong, the just and unjust, the terms of principle, in which they want to maintain their affairs. And they take it as a critical object to preserve or cultivate that sense among one another about the terms of principle we're trying to preserve here. So when the question was raised, how does the polity engage in moral teaching? The answer was, it teaches through the laws. So when we say that discrimination on the basis of race by private business, open to transactions for the public, we're now going to lift that from the domain of private choice and treat it now as a wrong, as a matter of public obligation. Now, if you take a look at the surveys, say between 1963 and 1966 on that Civil Rights Act, you find 63, 75% of the public were in favor of those laws that would bar racial discrimination. In the South, 73% of the people were opposed, taking the side of privacy. Three years later, the majorities were parallel. 75% of people in both sections. Now, what happened? Had there been a dramatic change in the culture of the South? Did it have something to do with the fact that some different moral lessons were being taught at the top of the state? Now, John Stuart Mill said we stop using the language of like and dislike and begin using the language of right and wrong as we think someone may be punished for what they're doing. The law conveys its seriousness with a sting of punishment. Yeah, it's a sting of punishment that tells us we really do regard this as something more than a personal taste. So when the beloved Joe Rouse, who's sure that autonomy doesn't mean the right to do anything, he's still reluctant to have the law teach moral lessons through the use of coercion. Those are something demeaning about the laws that deliver people from the vices that may corrupt them over the years. He neglects the fact that, yes, it is through the sting of the law that the law conveys its seriousness about this matter. Then it turns in a curious way of what we argue about religion. We say, no, we should not use the law to frame religious doctrine. But of course, we realize that to refrain from religion, of coercion, means that the law will have to be refrained from the things the law must do, even in protecting religion. So yes, we did use the law for the sake of barring human sacrifice, suttee, burning widows on funeral pyres, or practicing polygamy. Remind ourselves that the law did play a critical role here in diverting people from the things that ought not be done under the banner of religious freedom.
Perfect. Thank you. So we didn't plan this, but that was perfect to set up questions to both Carter and Andrew.
Of course.
What I was anticipating you would say, but we didn't actually script it as such. Carter, when Hadley mentioned that we get to the logic of morals has an implication for the logic of law, and that we identify something that is wrong to do, and it's not just wrong for Andrew to do it, but it's wrong for anyone to do it. That clearly has implications for public bioethics. And the work that where you first got to know Robbie deeply was on the President's Council on Bioethics, where you served as general counsel. Yuval was there as one of the senior staffers. Eric Cohen, this was the Leon Cass Commission, if you remember back. This is the President Bush Council on Bioethics. Can you share with us a little bit about how Robbie deployed this pluralistic, perfectionist political theory, the natural law, moral philosophy, to the raging debates at the time were about cloning, embryo destructive research? I mean, the best we were able to do, it's not what Hadley would want, which is a law that would have prohibited destruction of embryonic human beings. It was an executive order saying no federal funding for the destruction of embryonic human beings. And even that was then declared the Republican war on science, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Take us back. This is 20 years ago. A lot of people in the room were in infancy when these debates were, the hottest debates going on.
They were themselves embryos at the time. I mean, the two core insights of the book that we're celebrating, I mean, the idea that it's appropriate for the government and law to promote virtue and educate in virtue and educate about principles of justice and the good. And secondly, that those principles are intelligible and accessible and explainable by universally accessible human reason were embodied in Robbie's service on the President's Council on Bioethics in the most high-impact ways. So the two big questions, the biggest question was the question of the moral status of embryonic human beings at the embryonic stage of development, which obviously cascades into other deep and vexed questions in American public life, abortion being, immediately comes to mind. But then also at the opposite end of life spectrum, we dealt with questions involving end-of-life decision-making, caring rightly for the elderly, and even the definition of death. And in his person and in his interventions, and also in his mentorship of me and Yuval and Eric and his colleagues on the council, Robbie just sort of his contribution to the public discourse was as important as any I've ever seen in my entire career, focusing on the question of public bioethics. Let me make it more concrete. So the question of the embryo. And even describing it that way is kind of making it an abstraction, which plays into a perspective that I actually reject. I mean, we're talking about human beings at the embryonic stage of development. It was really Robbie, more than anyone else, who, first of all, with the work of his colleagues, mastered the scientific principles of embryological development such that he could speak in an intelligible and forceful way about the status of the embryo, first of all, as a whole organism, dealing with sort of metaphysical questions of parts and wholes, and the idea that it's a self-directing, living member of the human family that needs, like all of us, a hospitable environment to flourish in his or her mother's womb, for example, and that there's no meaningful moral distinction or distinction in terms of questions of justice in the size, location, condition of dependence, or esteem of others. And if all of this, in my description right now, sounds familiar to you, it's because Robbie pioneered and crystallized those arguments. Mm-hmm. Those are the most important public arguments about the moral status of the unborn child and the human being at the embryonic stage of development that trades in the embryological realities and the nomenclature, which sadly is changeable based on corrupt impulses of those who sort of police the nomenclature in embryology textbooks and in the scientific community. But that's Robbie's voice. When you hear that, when you hear those phrases, and I use them all the time, I've used them in my books, you've used them in yours. Those are Robbie's. Those are Robbie's words, okay? Right. And those are Robbie's words, synthesizing not just the biological knowledge, but also the principles of justice. Yeah. The idea that basic human equality requires that you treat all members of the human family with the same basic regard, and they have to have the basic protection of the law from lethal private violence and can't be used and created and destroyed for someone else's benefit. That's Robbie, and that has become the cornerstone of all arguments and thinking about the questions at the beginning of life in the biomedical science context, in the abortion context. It is part and parcel, and rebutting all of the sort of personhood arguments of Tooley and Boonin and Marianne Warren and the dependency arguments of Judith Jarvis Thompson. And Robbie did all of that work for us. Yep. And it reflects, first of all, because it was a government-issued report. And if you want to, I mean, you go to his personal statement from the cloning report, from Human Cloning and Human Dignity, 2002, he and Alfonso Gomez-Lobo's personal statement to this day is what I assign my students to think about the beginnings of human life from an ethical perspective, alongside some other stuff too, but it's never left the syllabus. And that was a government report, so that is the government speaking and forming people in the sense of morals. But it also requires the truth of the second proposition that you can make these intelligible. You can make these arguments based in human reason that are acceptable or rejectable based on, regardless of your faith commitments or your cultural commitments. So that's the beginning of human life, and then at the end of human life, he did the same thing, right? When we wrote the book, or when the council produced the report, Taking Care, Ethical Caregiving for an Aging Society, The question of assisted suicide came up. The question of terminating life-sustaining measures came up. And those of us who are Catholic are familiar with the ordinary and extraordinary means. But those labels are labels. They're not tools of analysis. They don't help you discern what exactly the proposed intervention is or isn't in terms of whether it's morally obligatory or not when a person whose very life is dependent upon those interventions. And Robbie got to work again in a government document. And this was a matter of real controversy. People got very upset with us. The President's Council. John Kerry and John Edwards said that they would dissolve the President's Council on Bus and fire the staff. I called Yuval. I'm like, they're going to fire us if they win in 2004. That was a stressful election to watch. Happy about the Ohio. I still very vividly remember that. But in any event, the bottom line, and you will also recall at the Democratic National Convention, they had John Edwards saying, people will get out of wheelchairs and walk if we're elected.
Christopher
Reeve, and people will get out of their wheelchairs. And then Ted Kennedy sort of, in a macabre statement that had multiple layers of meaning, said, we will clear out all the nursing homes in Massachusetts. I'm like, whoa. Like, what are you going to do with the people? If you adopt the policies that we're espousing, that Robbie and colleagues on the President's got. But Robbie was the principal architect of the argument, translating Catholic moral principles of end-of-life decision-making, not doing it in a self-conscious way, but effectively and functionally translating those principles into an intelligible framework that anybody can understand and accept or reject on its own merits, namely the question of whether or not a particular intervention is unduly burdensome, and that's a capacious concept. There's a lot to talk about as to what constitutes burdensomeness, or if it's futile, if it doesn't achieve its proximate end of addressing whatever the clinical pathology happens to be. If it's either one of those things, then it's not morally obligatory. And in Catholic nomenclature, we'd call that extraordinary versus ordinary means, right? But that's something that is in a government document published by the U.S., set forth by the executive branch and circulated and still lives on in perpetuity. And those are living examples and embodied examples of what Robbie argues in the book that we're here to discuss. And it has had extraordinary consequences in the field of public bioethics in my own work and the work of everybody on this stage, I know. Right. And then I would finally just conclude by saying that also Robbie's mentorship of folks like me and Yuval and you and his students, my colleague Sharif and others, is also a kind of generative embodiment of the goods that he's talking about at the core of that book as well. And so it's appropriate for us to be grateful to Robbie for mentorship in addition to his extraordinary intellectual contributions in the book.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that deserves applause.
And nothing sectarian about that teaching.
Right, exactly.
Nothing sectarian about that teaching.
No, not a bit. No.
And so actually, and now Carter, both you and Hadley have set up Andrew well, because I want to start asking you about evangelicals and natural law. Because what Carter was describing at the end there was, Robbie was taking a well thought out Catholic, moral casuistry, which Hadley then points out there's nothing sectarian about it. It just right. so happens that it had been very well worked out within the context of Catholic moral theology, but it can also be purely philosophical. Historically speaking, or modern history, if you go back to Luther and Calvin, but within 20th century evangelical thought, there was some skepticism and hostility to natural law. It seems like things have gotten so bad in the culture that there's a reconsideration of natural law. And it also seems like Robbie has played a role in this. Help us unpack some of that.
Yeah, certainly. So, there's definitely a retrieval of natural law going on in Protestant circles right now. That's absolutely for certain. But, it's interesting. Carter just gave reasons for the persuasiveness and the intelligibility of these convictions around the dignity of human life. And that brings me to kind of the dilemma of Protestants and evangelicals as we think about public ethics, is we tend to default to what I would refer to kind of as a fideistic ethic, is that if we only base our ethics if there's a Bible verse for the given issue. Now, please hear me. I am boldly Protestant. I love my Protestant tradition. I am pro-Bible. I want the Bible quoted. But if the Bible doesn't address an issue directly, like in vitro fertilization, what then do you do with that issue? You have to have reasons. a Protestant ethic can't just be purely voluntarist. There have to be reasons that we believe can have some degree of accessibility and purchase in the common domain. And we're here celebrating making men moral, and kind of the intellectual sequencing of how I got to know the work of Robbie George. It was actually that came much later in the chain of sequence. The very first book was the book The Clash of Orthodoxies, which we mentioned from the floor today. And I would like to remember how I came across The Clash of Orthodoxies. I still to this day can't remember the provenance of that book. But I remember as this, I think I would have been like 21 at the time. I remember being this 21-year-old kid, intellectually interested, and I'm reading this book on the clash of law, religion, and morality, and there's this guy from Princeton named Robert George, and he's making all of these arguments that I, as a Christian evangelical with a biblical worldview, was just absolutely enamored by. And he wasn't citing Scripture. It's not as though he's against Scripture. But he was making arguments that aligned or paralleled with what I would have called a biblical worldview. And this really was an intellectual revolution in my development. I was sitting in my office at Southern Seminary in Louisville in December of 2019, and I realized I had a whole bookshelf, or a whole shelf of a bookshelf with all of his books on it. And I remember emailing him, and I said, Robbie, this is a weird idea. What if I organized not really a festschrift, but a volume that had Protestant scholars and intellectuals familiar with your work, seeking to kind of translate your work into kind of a Protestant vernacular? And he jumped at the opportunity. And so I guess, 3 or 4 years later, the book Social Conservatism for the Common Good came out with Crossway, which is one of the premier publishers in evangelicalism. The fact that that wouldn't have happened 25 years ago. The fact that Robbie came to Southern Seminary's campus in February to lecture wouldn't have happened 25 years ago. You were there last year.
Yep. Dave Friedland, yeah.
That's a tremendous development to show you kind of where the intellectual firmament is right now with evangelicalism. And it speaks to the need for us to have reasons. And a story I like to tell to kind of demonstrate all of this is a few years ago, I was giving a set of talks at a very large suburban evangelical megachurch in Florida. We're talking the belt of the Bible Belt, or the buckle of the Bible Belt. Very large, thriving church. And I was there, I had written a book on gender ideology. I was giving several lectures over several days. And on the second night of my lectures, a teacher came up to me who'd been teaching there for several years, an adult teacher and been there, again, a long time there. And she said to me, I'm so thankful for your lectures. I never knew that we had good reasons to believe what we believe around the nature of being made male and female. And so I kind of, that was said in a quick rush, and so I went to give my lectures, and it was after that where I thought, my heavens, you have someone here who's been teaching for 20 years, and she's only thought that we can define what a male or female is by Scripture alone. Now, I'm a Protestant. I believe sola Scriptura is our highest authority, but it's not our only authority. Reason is one of those sources of authority as well. And reason gives us that vocabulary to enter into the public domain. And one of the challenges right now and Catholicism is having it, Protestants are having it as well. You have the integralists with the Catholic side. You have the Christian nationalist conversation in Protestantism. There's two temptations in Protestant thought. We could call it the catacomb option, which is to kind of ghettoize, sectarianize, go off on the margins, run for the hills. We don't have anything to do with the public domain. It's just basically rearranging chairs on the Titanic, let it burn. That's problematic. That's withdrawal. That's not loving your neighbor. The opposite error is what I would say is the Constantinian option, where you believe that because you're right, therefore you have singular authority and right to be the one in control of the public domain. And if you haven't noticed, we're not in control of the public domain. So then how do we go about seeking to influence? Well, you have to have reasons. And it has to be wedded to both truth and gregariousness, which is what I think Robbie possesses. And so I think in my own life, literally sometimes before I'm crafting a tweet, I'll think, is this something, both in terms of conviction and in tone, that something like Robbie George would say? And I think this just speaks to, I think, the influence of Robbie that has transcended Princeton, has transcended just Catholicism, it's transcended into my domain. And as you said, you've got Hadley, you've got Robbie, you've got Carter, me, Sharif. We're all seeking to kind of translate those views out to a new generation. And I'm trying to really, concentrically put those out into a Protestant audience.
Awesome. Yeah, we can clap. Yeah. Hadley, how do you think about when Andrew kind of described the two options that many evangelicals are experiencing, the catacombs or the Constantine option? How do you see this within the legal conservative world? How do you, there are debates within Federalist Society members. When he says we have to be able to take our reasons into the public square and be persuasive, you more or less have been doing this for 50 plus years. What do you think is distinctive about this moment in our nation's history, about our politics, about our campus culture? If Hadley had another 50 years, what would the project be looking like? What would change? What do we need right now from the next generation, Hadley?
Well, I'm tempted to be looking into apartments in Budapest, actually. But no, it's pretty. No, actually, something Andrew said brought me back to precisely the kind of question you're raising, Ryan. He reminded me of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith when Ratzinger was there, when he said, "It's not always been in Italy or a Hungary, but as long as there are human beings, there must be male and female. That is the telos, the very purpose of sexuality, meaning of sex." So when the court faced the question of transgenderism and sexual discrimination, we found our guys arguing, well, what did they mean in 1964 by sexual orientation? Inconceivable they could have meant the transgenderism. But the other side would say, look, we have a more expansive view of what we mean by racial discrimination since the 14th Amendment. The framers of the 14th Amendment didn't think that the 14th Amendment barred racial segregation or even barred those restrictions on interracial marriage. Well, we must have a more expansive view of what we mean by racial discrimination, and same way with sex. And I think the answer to that is not to be looking at the dictionaries from 1964, but say, what must it really mean? Is there not an objective truth here? And the question for us is that some of our friends are reluctant to make that move to the objective truth of the matter and feel confined to stay within that text rather than make the move to the objective truth of the matter. We may deal with that in the last session today about some of the reservations some of our people have. But by the way, I just can't wait to make this. Ryan majored in music, but he knew all these arguments. And we were doing these things before you were a sub-freshman, right?
At Mammoose.
And doing a seminar on these things. And he came to the matter of wanting graduate work. Didn't have a course on political science, but he knew all the arguments. He absorbed them all from Robbie and from listening, and then went on and to his own graduate career. But no one has known these things as well as Ryan from the very beginning. But anyways, back to you.
So Hadley is actually too modest. Didn't learn it all from Robbie. You were my first teacher in political philosophy. And it was those Eastern Shore summer seminars we did together.
On the shore, yeah.
But Carter, similar question to you that I posed to Hadley. It seems like when you and Robbie were working together 20 years ago on the President's Council on Bioethics to where we are today, a lot has changed. Yeah. And obviously, I hope you don't plan on retiring anytime soon, that you have some years left at Notre Dame where you'll be working on the law and public bioethics. What do you kind of see coming down the pike? Where should we be deploying some of Robbie's arguments to new areas, developing them? What are the threats we have to be thinking about? What should people in this room be thinking for next generation of public bioethics?
So, I mean, public bioethics comprehends an enormous array of human activity. I mean, when I say public bioethics, I mean the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. So that includes, and in my own work, I focused on the challenges of advances in biomedical science and biotechnology, but there's something even more basic, it seems to me, that we have to focus on at the moment. I mean, the Dobbs case itself allowed for the first time in 50 years self-governance on the question of abortion.
Yeah.
And we've had some, maybe we never had it, but it seems to me that our public discourse has atrophied in 50 years. And we haven't really been able to have a good conversation at any level. Politicians don't speak about the topic in thoughtful and compelling and persuasive ways. We've seen a whole series of referenda in which the public have taken. I mean, in Montana, they voted down a law that would have required the rendering of emergency care to newborns who survive abortions on the same basis and to the same extent that they would newborns who weren't the subject of attempted abortions. And that is like, if you ask a person on the street, do you think that a baby who survives an abortion should receive the same kind of medical care or palliative care or whatever? Not to say that you're going to take the baby away and force all this care on them as you would under any other circumstance. 90% of people, at least that I know, and I know a lot of crazy people, would say, yeah, I'm in favor of abortion rights, but that's not abortion. Yeah. And yet, in Montana, they basically voted down a bill that was meant to protect against a kind of infanticide. And that sort of should get, I mean, it's one thing, I mean, the politics is messy and complicated, and there's funding and messaging and organizational structures and things are, but I think, honestly, the question of abortion is the question that we should actually be talking about right now, and there's no better guide through that thicket than Robbie's thinking on that question, not just on the ontological and moral status of the unborn child and what justice requires, but also in terms of zooming out and thinking about what justice requires in other and compassion and mercy and hospitality and solidarity requires in terms of interpersonal relationships between mothers, babies, families, et cetera. I honestly think, I mean, I would say that the question of abortion is very much alive, and there's a need to have articulate, thoughtful, humane, winning, not just arguments, but also modeling of certain kinds of virtues in one's own behavior that is essential for that crucial debate that's unfolding right now. There's a very interesting thing that happened in public bioethics on the issues that we were working on 20 years ago with respect to embryonic stem cell research. It kind of went away. You've all wrote about this. Why did it go away? Why are we not, after President Trump was elected in 2016, why did we stop talking about the funding of embryonic stem cell research? And the short answer to that question is President Trump didn't make that part of his policy priorities. He did not seek to change President Obama's policy on that. In fact, there was the lack of attention to that issue from the executive branch. It was like the conversation had ended. And yet there are all kinds of things happening in biotechnology, especially touching and concerning the beginning of human life, that should be a matter of concern to the public. And we need to revivify those conversations as well. And again, those questions of ontological matters involving the status of the unborn and the baby and the embryo in the dish or in the freezer, those are all the same arguments that Robbie and Alfonso and others pioneered, and we have to start there, even though now there are a lot more forms of manipulation that can be done in that domain that require new arguments, but arguments that will grow from that foundation.
Perfect. Andrew, similar question. What do you see as the issues that evangelical scholars who are in the Robbie-style tradition should be directing their attention to? What's coming down?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would put all of this under the broad category of anthropology. Number one, I think it's fascinating. I think it's being published this month. Carl Trueman gave the Erasmus lecture.
It'll be in the next issue of First Things.
He riffed off of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, which, interestingly enough, we're in the 80th year since that came out. and he titled his talk "The Desecration of Man," to build off of that, because he's speaking to the reality that we haven't just engaged in materialistic degradation of the human body. We're beginning to engage in almost kind of neo-pagan understandings of the body. And I think that's where we need to be putting a lot of our focus and energy. Obviously, I'm going to totally agree with what Carter just said about the human atrocity of abortion. And, we have to think about that from a bioethics standpoint, but we also need desperate work on the political front, with that matter. And then I'll just conclude by saying this. The artificial intelligence question scares me. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this in terms of what this means for displacement of human engagement in society, enhancement of human engagement in society. And so my own assessment right now is I don't think that either Christians or conservatives have yet put out proper frameworks for artificial intelligence. And so I would be pleading with individuals who are of the type that would be in this room to be doing that.
Carter, do you want to jump in, or you're just making eyes
I just
at
want to underscore. I like to make eye contact with you generally, but this was. I just want to underscore what Andrew just said. Also, I mean, it seems to me that the pedagogical function of law is not simply to teach, and this is arguments that Carl and I have made in different contexts. They're not simply to teach about justice and equality, but it's law is designed and is meant to and means nothing unless it protects and promotes the flourishing of persons. But that very concept requires you to have a conception of what human identity is and what human flourishing is, the anthropological question that you just underscored. Yeah. And law has to teach the truth about what human beings are and what human flourishing is. Now, I realize that's a contested question and people disagree strongly, and we live in a pluralistic society. But my point is there's no way you can't reason unless you settle that question even provisionally for yourself, because what would it mean to try to argue about human flourishing if you haven't settled the ex ante question, the first question of, well, what is human flourishing, and which it connects to what persons are. And when law teaches falsehoods about what persons are and teaches a kind of dualistic account of what persons are, and Robbie's written a lot about that too, or if it teaches expressive individualism, reduces the person to a will and a mind and subordinates the body to an instrumental value, that has very serious downstream consequences. And the sort of prioritizing cognition in the way that AI does, and to the detriment of genuine psychosomatic unity of the human person, is something very dangerous that we have to address.
And he just mentioned the pedagogical function of the law on communicating truths or falsehoods about the human person. And I should have mentioned the concern I have about euthanasia. We're currently, I think it's 6 jurisdictions in the United States?
11.
11, okay, well, way off. So there you go.
Assisted suicide.
And literally just this morning, I saw a tweet from Prime Minister Trudeau. I'm not sure if you saw this yesterday, where Canada has a genuine suicide crisis going on in its culture. I don't think this is probably limited just to questions of assisted suicide, but there is a culture of despair and a culture of meaninglessness that practices like euthanasia, assisted suicide only contribute towards. And so I think this is going to have to be something we have to give additional thought.
Yep, so I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the book that I'm going to be writing next year with Andrew Kubik. Similar to the book that Robbie Sharif and I did on marriage, the book I did on transgender stuff, the book that Alexandra DeSanctis and I did on abortion. I want to do one on assisted suicide, because I think that is an issue that even people who agree with us on the moral issue are woefully underprepared for being able to articulate in the public square, and there's a need for this. Hadley wants to get in. I'm going to say we have time for a lightning round.
Okay.
So it's going to be one last question for each of you. But Hadley, you can preface it with what you want to jump in on. And the last question.
Yes, no answer?
No. It's just a light. Give us 60 seconds to 90 seconds so we can get to audience Q&A. Just share a story or some way in which Robbie has impacted you, your scholarship, your life. Because you all know Robbie well. He's had, I think people would enjoy some of the more personal side here.
Oh my God, how do you go back? We were together like 30 some years. Don McGahn says the pro-life issue has been in the Republican platform for 40 years. Do you think the Republicans have figured some way of talking about it? You know, Robbie say that the problem with President Bush for us was that he was all action and no talk. And we needed to talk. And so we came up with the Born Alive Act. Robbie was with me when we did the Born Alive Act. Can we start with the simplest? This is something I started as a draft I wrote for the first Bush, when it looked as though they were going to return the issue of abortion to the political arena. We'd have them say, look, we've been governed by the courts for so long, we need a conversation before we start legislating. The other side says abortion is not infanticide. They suggest we're going to protect the child at some point. Let's invite them to tell us when. How about birth? Because we've already had a judge saying that a child survives an abortion, undergoes a surgery, dies. Was there an obligation to preserve his life? No, that is not a person protected under the law. So Robbie and I were going to start with that, with the Born Alive Act. And we dropped the penalties from the act for the sake of averting a veto from Bill Clinton. And then, after all the killings done by Kermit Gosnell, we brought it back. And this time what we found was that parties are utterly cohesive. Every Republican voted in favor of restoring penalties and punishments for the people who killed a child born alive. Every Democrat, except for one or two pro-lifers, voted against. So the Democratic position is that right to abortion is a right with no limits. What it means is the right to a dead child. Okay. But no, we were after us. Remember, as we were working on different things to present to in the hearings, and they couldn't say our words, and Robbie said, we not only have to provide the language, we have to probably have to move their jaws, you know, to have them. I remember we had because we had one point we had Sotomayor. We're going to have Justice Sotomayor tell us, when do you think? What is your rendering of Roe versus Wade? What does it mean? And she says, only under certain circumstance. Oh, my goodness, there's an opening. No, it's for the entire life of the pregnancy. And at that moment, Coburn says, good. Now let's talk about guns. He lost his focus, which is why Robbie said, God, not only do we have to write the script, we're going to have to move their jaws to make sure we get this done. Carter?
Yeah, I'm going to... This will be a little more lighthearted than talking about murdering babies and old people. I was exaggerating for the sake of illustration, as Leon used to say. There's a funny story. So Robbie, I learned about Robbie. I think I learned about Robbie by reading about him in Crisis Magazine. There was some profile of Robbie in Crisis Magazine, and I started to learn about him. And it turns out we have overlapping histories, and so he's from West Virginia. My mom's from West Virginia. My mom's from Clarksburg. He's from Morgantown. My mom's Italian. His mom's Italian. Every Italian person from that part of West Virginia is from not just the same part of Italy, but the same village in Calabria called San Giovanni in Fiore. And so when we met, that was a shared source of fellowship. And then years later, when my cousin was running for Congress in West Virginia, I called Robbie and I said, Robbie, my cousin's running for Congress in West Virginia. He's like, wait, is your cousin? I'm not going to name the person, but is this your cousin? And he's like, I'm like, yeah. He's like, that's my cousin too. And so we realized that we, in fact, are distantly related to each other as cousins on the Italian side. And then we both agreed that no one should vote for our cousin. Because he's unreliable and would be a bad politician.
Well, then you should say the name so we know.
He lost, so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I have a more lighthearted one as well. This was probably, I'm guessing, 7 or 8 years ago at this point, and I didn't know him as well as I know him now. But I had written an essay somewhere criticizing the Catholic view of contraception as inconsistent. I actually forget the nature of the argument. So I float that out there into my Protestant blogosphere, and it does what it does. And then I wake up one morning, and there's like a 1,000-word email. I see Robert P. George in my inbox, and I'm thrilled, right? Like, oh gosh, Robbie George has emailed me. And then I opened the email and he's proceeded to like just line by line dismantle my argument. But did it in the most gracious way. In fact, I think I wrote him back and I said, Professor George, I don't think I've ever felt so honored to be told I'm wrong as I was in this email. And I recount that story in the book, but genuinely, I was as a younger kind of academic at the time, to be told you're wrong by someone occupying the McCormick Chair of Jurisprudence at Princeton, that's kind of cool.
All right, so I think we have time for some questions, and if you watching online, you can email Sophie Riziera at aei.org. Hope. Oh, wait for the microphone so people online can hear you.
Well, I want to urge everyone this is a question for Andrew Walker, and I want to urge everyone to read the book because you don't have to be Protestant to benefit from it. But one of the things, the three themes that stood out to me was how lovable Robbie is and how important that is to his messaging. I mean, messaging is one of these terrible terms, and the fact that he's not biblical enough. That was a running theme that very, very critical of him for that. And the third is there was a certain tone of resentment and lamentation that there isn't a comparable Protestant figure to him, and that was very much mentioned. But I wanted to ask Andrew, was it a risky move, somewhat comparable to Robbie's Making Men Moral, for you to kind of establish? Has there been any pushback for you about it from Protestants? And what's been the impact of it among the Protestant community?
No, thanks. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Many in this room are academics, and they've either edited volumes or they've contributed to edited volumes. And the consistent theme of edited volumes are they're not popular and they don't sell, right? 10 people buy an edited book. As a sign of, I think, encouragement, this book from Crossway has actually sold really, really well. So I think that is actually a sign that there is some purchase of these issues, and I think Robbie is quite well known in Protestant intellectual circles. And in fact, if I can bring this back to a story with Ryan that will relate, I remember one time it was actually the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Let's just say Ryan wasn't happy on Twitter that day, just to put it mildly, and he was having his opinion shared. And
it wasn't that big a deal.
And so everyone knows me as kind of like the bridge to the new natural law Catholic world, and they're all texting me being like, "What bee got in Ryan Anderson's bonnet today? Tell him."
Luther.
Yeah, exactly, Luther. And so I texted him and I said, "Hey man, I totally get this day is not your day. But one thing you should consider, I would argue that more students at Southern Seminary probably purchase your books than some Catholics in some parishes do." And I think that story kind of parallels with what goes on with someone like Robbie. I think if you went to the Colson Center, Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, his name, and the statewide public policy organizations that are all family policy oriented, he's a well-known commodity. And I think that speaks to the reality that a lot of the religious right movement in the 1980s onward was predominantly a political movement. It was not substantively a moral, it was a moral movement, but it was not. It was undergirded by a strong biblicism, which is obviously good. Again, we're pro-Bible here, but you had these social conservative organizations saying, yes, the Bible is good, but we're trying to advocate for these policies at the federal and local level. How do we do this? And they are going to someone like Robbie George.
And actually, I think it was like 5 or 10 years ago that Time Magazine had a list of the 50 most influential evangelicals. And Robbie and I both showed up on it. And then they had to issue a correction. Neither Robbie nor Ryan are evangelical. All right, we have, yes, over here. Wait for the microphone so people streaming can hear your question.
Thank you. A question for Andrew is, as a good old Southern Baptist boy, and also drawn to natural law,
Right.
I'm very excited about your upcoming book. Russell Moore did a piece in First Things a while back where he talked about how evangelicals, Protestants, had maybe kind of coming late to the party on marriage and family and even contraception. Are there any other areas where Protestants, evangelicals, old Baptists can learn from the Catholic / natural law tradition?
So I'm seeing for the first time the language of common good getting into Protestant social thought in ways that maybe it was there 30 years ago. I mean, I've read the EPPC volumes from 30 years ago. It doesn't seem like it was there that much from Protestants. I'm beginning to see in the Protestant intellectual world a much broader, comprehensive understanding of society as an overall organism and how all of the parts, as Carter said, with navigating parts with the whole, Protestants are getting better at that. And so I'm encouraged by the development of common good thinking. I think that's going to obviously have to be translated into more biblical categories for it to get purchase. So I talk about this in my upcoming book. Jeremiah 29 talks about seek the welfare of the city, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. That's tied to a call basically for cultivating culture, a love of family, a love of roots, a love of where you are. And so I'm encouraged that could be a developing field for us to benefit from.
Yeah, right here in the middle. Microphone's coming.
The late Governor Dick Lamb of Colorado made an uttering once that old people have a responsibility to die.
Yep.
Old people have a responsibility to die. I'm just wondering if any of you four scholars can connect the metastasizing of a pro-choice, pro-abortion culture and whether or not that will lead to the generation that is aborted by its parents. Will they be inspired to euthanize their offspring? Be euthanized by their offspring.
So, I mean, I don't know the context of the governor's quote there, but I do know a very similar quote. It was from Baroness Marianne Warnock, a bioethicist in the UK, who, in the context of the assisted suicide and euthanasia debate, said that if you're demented, if you're, she had a list of various forms of disability. She said, you're wasting your life, you're wasting the NIH's or the NHS's tax dollars, and you have a duty to die. And so I can't speak to the context of the Colorado governor's statement, but yes, there are thinkers, including a baroness who's a public bioethics scholar, saying that if the quality of your life, whether it's because you're old or you're infirm or you suffer from a disability, is such that you are a life that is better off not living, then you have a, quote, duty to die. And then the experience that we're seeing from the Netherlands, from Canada, from other places that have allowed assisted suicide is it very quickly moves to non-voluntary euthanasia for disabled children, for elderly people. It tends not to be upper middle class, white, socially economic, kind of like well-situated people. It tends to be the people in the peripheries, racial minorities, people who already lack adequate access to health care, people who experience various forms of disability. And this is why I think it's coming. Our grandparents and our parents will internalize that they have a duty to die, and many of our contemporaries will think that my life would be better if my parents would just off themselves. Why won't they? They're being selfish by continuing on, and it does lead to all those forms of like soft social pressure. In addition to the, and you guys should both jump in.
Yeah, I just want to very briefly. So Dick Lamb was basically a eugenicist. I mean, he was an open eugenicist about using different kind of interventions, including assisted suicide, euthanasia, to promote his vision of social hygiene. And so what I've argued in my book and in the past is that the law here actually plays a very, potentially very problematic and dark role insofar as, and I keep coming back to thinking about what the governor of California said when he was signing into law California's law legalizing assisted suicide.
After Brittany Maynard.
After Brittany Maynard. And he said, I am doing this, and I'm doing it in a way that so as to secure my freedom to when I judge my life to be no longer worth living, to take steps into my own hand and die, author the final chapter of my book, my life story as I see fit. And when you're making law, my immediate reaction, like, what an extraordinarily short-sighted and selfish thing to do. Maybe you have the resources as a wealthy person, as a white person, as a person who is at the apex of your society, to have the freedom, and maybe you'll be fortunate enough to have the not to be laboring under the coercive effects of circumstance or your body itself to be able to make a free and unencumbered assertion of your will. But that's like, if those people exist, it's like this much of the population. And you don't make laws that expose the peripheries, that expose the elderly and racial minorities and the disabled and the poor to this path of least resistance, which will sweep them up into lethal consequences. And again, it trades in a false anthropology of what human flourishing is. Is human flourishing defined entirely by cognitive functioning, by the capacity to interrogate the depths of one's interior sentiment and then project your life plan and follow it accordingly? Is that what human flourishing is? Or is human flourishing about loving and being loved and networks of giving and receiving? And if the law takes the wrong anthropological premise as its foundation, the consequences are devastating. Yeah.
Just throw another point. Once you've established the predicate that that's a life not worth living, right. Well, then why should this person be deprived of being delivered to this good if he has no relatives around? Right. So we establish the ground on which some other person, some stranger in a hospital, can make the decision for him. I keep thinking that marvelous case of Elizabeth Bovia, remember, the quadriplegic. Mm-hmm. She could have died at home, but she put herself in the hospital so she could power through the courts to claim that she had a right to die, to take her life, which would mean right to compel other people to administer death to her, right to die because she has a life utterly devoid of moral purpose. This goes to court, and Judge Beetz says, yes, she is absolutely right. Her life is so devoid of meaning, she has a life not worth living, but we're giving her lawyer's fees because she managed to push through the court a case in the public interest. So she had a life utterly devoid of moral significance, and that's she pushed through the court. Well, she professed to have lost her appetite for food, but her appetite for litigation proved inappeasable. Once she survived. Okay.
John DiIulio, who I should mention, you wrote the foreword to Clash of Orthodoxies.
Well, you had to bring that up, didn't you?
The microphone's right behind you.
Yeah, you had to bring that up. Right. But yes, we asked the question, as Andrew, when he does his tweets, we all ask, what would Robbie do? That's what we do. It's a little blasphemous.
Right.
But listen, I have a question. It's a why now question. But before I get to that, Andrew, you're quoting Jeremiah. I want to dispel some stereotypes that have been circulated about Catholics in the Bible. That was 29:7. That was Jeremiah 29:7. Thank you. And I will challenge any of you to a sword drill after this sword drill challenge. So in the 90s, I joined the Board of Prison Fellowship Ministry with my late great friend Chuck Colson. He was then deeply engaged with Father Richard John Newhouse. He was also engaged with someone who was styled as on the evangelical left, my late great friend Ronald J. Sider at Evangelical Social Action. And all this was happening. There was this ferment. There was these dialogues, Catholic, intra-evangelical. It came and then it sort of went. So here it's back.
Yeah.
Why now?
Yeah, I think my explanation for that, and I'm a huge Chuck Colson admirer, a hero. I don't think that his ministry focus had been properly calibrated to intellectual environments, particularly evangelical higher educational institutions. And so I think if it's existing in parachurch organizations, that's good, but it's going to have to get into the institutions that can have a trickle-down effect. And that's happening now in ways that I think it did not previously. Honestly, I'm looking forward to a time 50 years from now, I'm still alive, where historians look back at what I would say is roughly early 2000s into the present day, where there has been a true retrieval and resurgence of natural law thought in Protestants. So the work of Stephen Grable, David Van Drunen, David Haynes, Jordan Baller, Micah Watson, wherever he is. I mean, they have a book coming out next year on an Augustinian account of natural law. The Davenant Institute with Brad Littlejohn. I mean, I would actually say right now, in the intellectual firmament of conservative Reformed Protestantism, I would say that natural law is becoming not necessarily the default, but it's not becoming an issue of immediate attack.
And we'll go to Chris Wolf. And as the microphone goes there, I'll just say, and John, what we're trying to do at EPPC is embody that Newhouse and Colson evangelical and Catholic alliance. I mean, it's what Andrew and I are doing. It's what Carter and I mean, that's what we're trying to do there.
If I can just say one last thing to this, I'm sorry. I just taught a sexual ethics class this past fall, and I'm quoting the Bible. I'm quoting Robbie, Ryan Sharif, Melissa Muscella in class in the readings that they're doing, and the students walk away from this class like their minds are blown, and they're realizing, oh, we're not sacrificing the Bible. We're not placing all of our trust in reason. They're balancing this in proper proportion with proper expectation. And if you can impact a place like Southern Seminary with that, which is regarded as one of the largest, most influential conservative seminaries in the world, that should send a ripple effect for broader movements.
All right, we have 2 minutes, so 60 seconds for the question, 60 seconds for the answer.
Yeah, I think euthanasia is going to be a big issue in the future, even bigger than it is now. The question is this. I really believe in natural law arguments. That's what I focus on. I mean, it's a pluralistic society, so I tend to steer clear of things based on religion. I'm wondering if that's possible with respect to euthanasia. And the distinctive thing about euthanasia is how the debate is going to turn so much, even if sometimes falsely, on suffering. And you can give a rational argument for the meaningfulness of suffering, but it's a tough haul. It really, I think, to be effective, probably, more recourse than ordinarily to religious ideas of the value of suffering may be necessary in that case. I'm wondering if you share that view.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. I mean, the two principal arguments for euthanasia, which is illegal everywhere in the United States, by the way, only assisted suicide is legal, is compassion, the idea of alleviation of suffering, and then also autonomy, maximizing self-determination. And in my experience, the strongest arguments, and those are hard arguments to respond to unless you can challenge the factual predicates that underlie those. Like, in fact, the vision of free, open decision possibility of making free choices when you're laboring under the strictures of your disease and stuff. That you're not. It's not the occasion of asserting your free and unencumbered will, and that's not even actually what people want to do. They want somebody to help them, right? And in terms of the compassion side, there's actually interesting social science evidence that shows that most people choose assisted suicide not because they're suffering, although pain management goes down in jurisdictions that legalize assisted suicide because it becomes a pathway of least resistance for the practitioners. Palliative care scores go down when you legalize it. But in any event, so a person's pain being badly managed is generally not the reason they seek assisted suicide. It's the fear of loss of autonomy, loss of being able to do the things, or being a burden to someone else. That's the other motivation. But in my judgment, in the public square, the strongest arguments, the most powerful arguments against assisted suicide and euthanasia are prudential arguments about, and you can even go back to the 1994 report on life and law by the New York Task Force, which was convened by Mario Cuomo and is composed entirely of liberal progressives, arguing that even though in principle we might support the freedom to end your own life, we cannot do that because the downstream consequences for the poor and the marginalized and racial minorities and the elderly would be so catastrophic that when you make public policy, you can't do it with the most privileged in mind. You have to think downstream to the most at risk. And there's simply no way to configure a regime of assisted suicide that wonon't result in massive instances of fraud, abuse, duress, coercion. Absolutely. And that's something that you can't risk. And I'll say Gene Rivers and he was instrumental and very helpful in the California campaign, making that point, especially for the African-American community, who saw immediately the problem of giving people the power over life and death for you, because there's a long history in bioethics of that being gravely abused for folks in the black community. And I should just real quick wanted to say, another person who deserves recognition for pioneering and disseminating the arguments about embryonic moral status and the questions of justice around it are Chris Tollefson and his work with Robbie and their extraordinary book Embryo.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention that before.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
We're out of time, so we're going to stop. Be back here at 2 o'clock for the next panel, and please join me in thanking this panel.